Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you have an interest in FDA regulated companies or their products, this is the podcast for you. Today's podcast is about people being non-traditional. If you are in the clinical research world and you're trying to figure out how do you do things that are compliant, but in ways that you hadn't considered. This might be the conversation for, and we have a very interesting voice for us today because she is a clinical trial manager in Boston. She is also, and she does not talk about this in her role as a clinical trial manager, but she's also an attorney. And again, no one mentions this because people seem surprised at this, has an MS in sports medicine. So if you are in clinical research, if you're trying to figure out how to comply with the law, if appropriate, maliciously comply with the law, which is a component we discussed briefly right before we went live. You should care about that. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today, Eunice Aikins-Afful. Hey, Eunice, how are you?
I'm great, Darshan. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Doing well. We already have Elizabeth Green saying, "Hey, Eunice." So
great to see you, Elizabeth. Thanks for coming.
So let's talk a little bit about your background. You have the traditional, the traditional non-traditional path, which is you said, you know what, I never wanted to be in pharma, so I'm going to go down, get a sports medicine degree, and then somehow there was the sweet piper of pharma that called you in. Tell us about your story. How did you get here?
Yeah, so I was working as a clinical coordinator at a hospital down in Baltimore, and the investigator that I was working for was the principal investigator to a trial. And in working with them, when the sponsor's internal coordinator, or I guess you'd call it an internal CRA or clinical research associate, when that person was promoted, there was an opening. And so I applied and took that job. And it was the first chance to really see how corporate America does both device and pharma. And as we kept going and we were moving towards sunshine, our chief counsel recommended that I go to law school.
That is not the traditional pathway. Our chief compliance officer recommended that my CRA, my coordinator, go and get a law degree. That is not something that happens often. How do you make that jump? How do you sort of go from I want to be working with people on the field to I want to leave the field far behind and become a lawyer because that's my calling?
So what I found when I was working in medical affairs was that people don't start out wanting to make mistakes. They start out wanting to know what they can do. And if we don't tell them what they can do, they'll default to their own devices. And so what I learned was, just being available to them and talking to them, we are all very aware of where the line is. It is bright and it is clear for a lot of things, especially off-label discussions, for example. But there are other things that are far less bright. And so how do we help guide them in that way? And so as we were looking for more information and trying to find better ways to help our sales team to stay on the right side of the road, I spent more time, with my presentations being vetted by counsel, and we just kept having more and more conversations. And he's like, well, yeah, that's a great point. Or, you should bring this up. And I was finding cases because this was right around the time when the government was actually arresting salespeople. And so all of a sudden I had their attention. And so I was able to just kind of make a good case for staying on the right side of the law. It's just not worth it to go to the other side.
So again, I feel like I'm sort of reconstructing your past because you are a riddle wrapped in an enigma. So far we've got that you were in sports medicine, you were helping people on the field. You then somehow went into medical affairs.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
So before we go on ahead, what is medical affairs?
So medical affairs is the safe harbor in an institution where people can ask questions. And so if a physician has a question about your product and it perhaps is off label, you want someone who's not represented in either the marketing or the sales department to answer that question. And it's usually a physician or someone with a medical background of some kind, or someone under them, like me, who is, trained in the science, trained in the literature. And I've read more articles than I ever thought I would read to, to present information to physicians to answer those questions. But again, outside of the sales force. So the sales force can bring you the person with the question, but you can't give the answer with them or around them. And so, I've had people take me off speaker, walk out of an OR, scrub out, and have those questions answered because, you have to again, you've got to stay on the right side of the rules.
So it's interesting you talk about that because there has been, one of the things you mentioned is it's very clear about off-label speech and persecution of off-label speech. But I'm guessing right around the time you were in medical affairs, you probably saw the Coronia decision, and you saw the Pacira decision, all of those where the FDA has actually lost those cases. So the question is that going to play out? So the safe harbor, is that the only safe harbor?
Right. Now you're spooling. Come back.
Keep finding out we don't have an official. So it's fuzzier to me. Was that?
I said you were spooling. Come back. Come back.
All I was suggesting is that we're going to have you come back and we're going to have you talk about it at that time. But that's going to be really
absolutely
fun.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that.
So you were in medical affairs, and then what you said was, I really don't like pharma. I want to work at a clinical trial site. How did that jump off happen?
So because I had this background in clinical trials, again, I had worked both at the sponsor level and at the hospital level. When I came to law school, I needed a job. And so I went through a night program. And in doing so, I worked in the daytime and I worked doing clinical trials. And I just kept gaining information and gaining knowledge and remembering that I truly enjoyed it. It's certainly not working with the patients on the same level that I was, but certainly, still providing something that's worthwhile and fulfilling nonetheless. And so as I've just kind of grown in my career in that way, just, getting to be a manager has been the next step.
Okay. So what does a clinical trial manager do now?
We are responsible for keeping the trains on the track and on time. So in the course of a clinical trial, you'll go through the study startup phase, you'll go through the phase in which the patients are receiving the drug, and then you'll go to study close. And so much of your time is spent making sure that you followed all of the rules, that you've collected all the appropriate documents, an essential documents package, for example, where you have the CVs that say that the investigators are qualified to do the research that you'd like them to do, where you have the medical license that says that the state has allowed them to touch a patient, and so on down the line. And you're checking those boxes for all of those folks. Well, then if you'd like to collect specimens during the course of your clinical trial, does the site have the necessary lab? Well, we need a lab certification, please. And so just making sure all of the pieces that are going to comprise your data at the end are in fact on par and correct, so that as you collect this data, you want to make sure that when you send it to the FDA that they say, oh gosh, yeah, this is right. This was done properly. Yes, we agree with your data. Yes, it was collected in the most appropriate fashion, and that it's not tainted or paid for or any of those nefarious things that people get worried about.
So you're talking about keeping things on track, keeping the documents covered, making sure that's happening the way they should be,
Sure.
making sure that all at study close, you've got all the documents together. So let's ask a couple of questions around that.
Yeah.
One of the latest things that came out, as you know, is this idea the is starting remote audits, and they don't want to call them audits. But what is your take on it?
So
have you been involved in any?
I've not been involved in it, but I will tell you, I think the pandemic has shown us that there are so very many things that you do not have to do in person. I think that if there's cause, you could easily make the case to say, well, gosh, we're going to go to Dr. Kulkarni's site because we do not trust what's coming out of there. That's a great reason to show up and do a deeper dive. But I really feel like there's reason to do it because you're saving time in the fact that look how many documents I can review if I didn't have to travel. Look at how many things I can go through and compare if I don't have to travel. If a CRA, a clinical research associate, travels to a site They've got to get there. They've got to meet with the staff. They need to meet with the investigator. They need to create a report. They need to do all these other things. So everything that's piling up at their home, for all the other sites that they're doing and again, for all the other trials that they're involved in, that's piling up someplace. If they're in fact in their home or their home office, they're able to review those documents and keep up with those emails and do some of the other pieces. And again, there's certainly a time and a place for making those face-to-face connections and actually getting to know the person you're working with, because again, it's an incredibly intense relationship. Again, it's not necessarily ideal. I can absolutely make the case, as a good attorney should. I can absolutely make the case for having the monitoring done in person. But again, when you're talking about an audit, it's, again, unless there's a really good reason for it, you're not having an audit in a typical way or in a typical day. That's not something that happens all the time. Monitoring happens daily. An audit, again, is there a reason that you're looking for that information? Is there something that has triggered the deeper dive?
Right. Which is kind of interesting to me. I feel like the last year and a half to 2 years really caused what we expected for the last 5. And what I mean by that is the FDA has been talking this whole time about centralized monitoring. They've been talking about how we're going to bring everything in. We're going to look for signals and then decide using risk-based monitoring that we're going to go out and audit the appropriate sites. And they didn't quite do it because if something went wrong, everyone has problems. So what I think we saw is at least the initial seeds being planted on how this can be done and this can be done right. Do you foresee, and again, we're not talking about your site. I don't even know what site you work for, but have you seen situations where there's another site where you went, you know what, it would have been better to do 100% monitoring as opposed to more of a risk-based monitoring, which is where we are right now?
Sure. So there was a case I learned about from a colleague a couple jobs ago. And so she happened to be working, she was a study coordinator. She was working with an elderly patient population. And she was talking to this gentleman, just absolute happenstance one day. Oh, what are you going to do for the rest of the week? He's like, oh, well, I'm in a clinical trial just like this one at such and such a site at Dr. So-and-so's place. And so what had happened was the patient and his buddies from his nursing home, because how you have those collective communities, they had gone to the first site because they were getting money for the trial, and then they had gone to the second site. And so there was like 10 or 15 patients, but they never told the doctors that they were in it. So it wasn't that the doctors were saying, oh, we want to count your data twice. It's that she realized over time that there was an actual band of people going to both places. So not only was she, required to report this, but she had to call the FDA. Like, there's no two ways about it, because you now have to unwind all of that and figure out how many of these subjects, because obviously they were eligible, but how many of them, how much of their data can you still use? And if the answer is none, who gets to keep it? Or excuse me, if the answer is only one, who gets to keep it? If the answer is none, the sponsors have paid for those 2 sites to be up and running, and they're going to get nothing out of it. And again, what kind of controls could you have put in place, or how else could this have better been handled? But it was, again, in retrospect, it's hilarious because, these folks they were doing something very honestly they didn't recognize was wrong. But from a sponsor standpoint or from a research standpoint, you're like, oh, so again, you don't see that one every day, but it definitely could happen. And so sharing the information and being explicit in your informed consent, making sure that document says, please inform your investigator if you are participating in any other studies. Please do not give blood for any other reason other than an emergency. Sharing those kinds of things and being explicit about it so your patient can tell you what their responsibilities are, hopefully can help put some of those things aside.
I think that's part of it. Part of the problem is the lack of education around clinical trials, and I feel like COVID has played a huge role in it. But I guess my next question to come out of that is, what is education the only thing? Like, one of the things I've seen. Have you heard of ORCID ID?
I've not.
It's just called ORCID's really around journal publications and to know who's the author. track that kind of stuff. But there's been a whole conversation about should you be doing something like that around subjects so that you can track which subjects are in which study. Quite honestly, I think I filed a patent for it a few years ago. But my point being, I think it's one of those areas that it's not just patients. It's really like, can you put that information onto a blockchain so that someone can, all the PIs, all the principal investigators can go back and start looking at it and go, is my study subject on the blockchain already for another study? And there's we've been afraid to do that for many, many reasons. How are you addressing that problem right now? Are you basically just doing contractually and saying, read this whole thing, or is there more to it?
So again, the informed consent process should be a process. It should be a conversation. And so if you're lucky, you've got someone who's on the front end preparing the patient to have the conversation with the person who's going to sign with them. So so sometimes it'll be the PI or the sub-I or even the coordinator or the research nurse. Again, depends on how that site works. But when I was a coordinator, I was responsible for walking the patient through the ICF, and then our physician would come in and ask key questions that would determine whether or not the patient actually understood what we had discussed. And then he would go back and make sure, because they were key, And so one of the studies I was involved in was everybody had to be 80 years old or older. So in very many of these cases, you're seeing their spouse or you're seeing their children. And so involving them in that conversation as well, so that there's an understanding of, you're coming back, and yes, we're helping you, but please know that you've got to get an x-ray, you've got to get blood work, you have to do these things. And so while you're saying that you're only coming to see the doctor and that part might take an hour, you're probably going to be here for 3, And so if the person that brought you has childcare concern or needs to be home by a certain time, we need to see you earlier in the day. If you have a requirement or another opportunity or someplace else you need to be, we need to know that and to work that in. So again, just little things that make it easier for the patient. Again, it's a conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. You talk about you're in the Boston area, so this may be less applicable, less relevant to you. But did you hear about the case in Pennsylvania around who should be doing the informed consent?
I didn't.
There was a court case.
What happened?
So there was a court case that came out and basically said that informed consenting is not a delegable duty, and was in the case of a neurosurgeon and actual surgery. So the question that people started exploring, this is probably about 2-3 years ago, does that apply to clinical research? And I'm not sure why it wouldn't, but there was an interesting case, and I didn't know if you'd heard anything about, are we seeing any kind of sea change around who does the consenting, or if it's just a Pennsylvania issue, or if it's not even in Pennsylvania. So
no, I think it's definitely a national issue. I think that it's something that everybody has to take, to pay attention to. From a surgery standpoint, when I was at a hospital, it was a very big deal to make sure that the residents understood that you start with the worst thing that can happen, and then as you're explaining all the risks, so start with death and work your way back, because you'll get someone's attention if you do that. And so just teaching that, again, having the conversation of understanding that. But I don't know that that's the best use of someone's time. If I'm the physician and I'm responsible for cutting on this person, absolutely, I should, be available to answer all of their questions. At the same time, if there's more to it, if there's more logistical questions or things like that come up, I may not have the answer if I'm the physician. It may be his staff, and so I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, how much money are you losing in a clinic, where the physician is talking to a patient and answering questions about parking, as opposed to letting that person be, passed off to someone else when the most important part of the conversation has been discussed. And so again, what's going to happen to me? What can I expect as a result of this procedure or as a result of this intervention? And how do I what can I expect as far as a recovery? Will I recover? If it's an oncology trial, the patient's expectation is death. It's not an adverse event. It's an expectation. So if that's my end, what else can I expect from this? So again, so many times you'll see, whether it's at St. Jude's or some of the other oncology centers, you'll see where they'll tell the patient, you cannot expect to benefit from this research. It's only what we learn from you, your participation. And so that's a different animal. But again, how much, again, how educated is the person that the PI is delegating to? And so again, has that person been trained? And so if you're talking about this, the standpoint of clinical research, everyone should have been trained on the study before they're even touching anyone. So if you've got the documentation that they've been trained, why is that not sufficient?
So that raises the other question, right? Because what we're seeing a lot of nowadays is this idea of e-consenting, if you will. And e-consenting has usually been referred to in the context of paperwork. But have you seen any steps in the context of e-consenting around, say, VR, or e-consenting around, say, videos of what might be happening to you? And if so, what's the uptake around it, and what have you sort of experienced around it?
So I've only gotten to hear about it, from the grapevine, if you will, and I've seen, and I've again, from what I've heard, again, it's an opportunity to save time, because again, if your physician is speaking to you on this video and you're kind of getting an idea of what they're going to talk about, if you don't have any questions,
right,
then you can go ahead and sign and be on your way. The problem is, then if I've done it at home at 8 o'clock at night, who was I going to ask? Will I actually take those questions to clinic with me and, do that? And furthermore, if the patient has questions, how could they sign? So again, I can absolutely see the virtue in explaining it and and being expedient. I know at some of the hospitals back when I was in Baltimore, they would have a tablet for the patient that would go through the steps, and it's kind of like a flow chart saying, what you can expect here, you can expect here, and you'll do this and you'll do that. And that was great, because then they can visualize, okay, I've got to get my lab work, I've got to get my x-ray, then I'm going to see the doctor, then they're going to do, I'm going to have my intervention, then I'm going to do more lab work. So then you can kind of see it as a visit and understand what you're actually getting into. And I thought that was brilliant. But if the person has a question, how is it really informed consent?
So here's the next question. Are you seeing blends of telemedicine come into this at that point, where the PI or a representative of the sponsor, for example, makes themselves available 24/7 using Siri, for example, and you can ask the questions you want to ask and available to you at the point you actually want to ask the questions?
So I've not seen that in practice, but I have seen the discussion, and it does sound interesting. And again, if the patient is informed, if the patient is truly informed, if I've finished this, I have no more questions, I'm ready to do it. Great spend of money, great opportunity. If in fact, the person doesn't feel comfortable with that, I know some people, they may not have a smartphone. They may not know how to use a smartphone. They may not have the right type of smartphone. If somebody says, "Oh, I'll FaceTime you," and they say, "Okay," and the person that you've asked, you don't ask them whether or not they have an iPhone. You've assumed they have an iPhone and they've got a flip phone. It's going to be a really long night. And so I think that we have to be careful that we don't leave those that don't have the same opportunities in technology, that we don't leave them behind. Because that divide was very evident in 2020, and we're certainly recognizing, again, it's all fine, well, and good if you have connectivity. Again, in Boston, the likelihood that I'm going to lose internet service is pretty slim. If I'm in Salt Lake, it may not be the same.
Right. Which is really kind of interesting. This idea of informed consent exposing the concept of, in some senses, diversity and inclusion, where we're talking about it. We always talk about diversity and inclusion in the context of, let's bring more voices in.
Sure.
And this is an interesting perspective of saying diversity in the context of, are we excluding voices because it's just onerous and I want to be on the cool cutting edge?
Right.
And maybe there's a better conversation to be had. Have you seen people try to address those topics yet, or are we still in the nascent stage of that?
We are still in the infancy.
Okay.
I think that there's so much. the conversation that clinical research seems to be having now is about, well, how do we include more people and what is that going to look like? And so we're still at the point of how are we including more patients that are diverse?
Yeah.
And so we already know that if you have a physician that looks like the patient is more likely to hear about the clinical research. But in some contexts, people are educated and they don't want to be guinea pigs. They don't want to be lab rats, and they are rightful in those apprehensions. And so it's again, we're still at the very beginning as far as where we can go and how far we can explore, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility to get there. But again, to go back to the rural issue for just a second, again, I might take, let's say I get my care in Omaha.
Right.
Because it was less than 2 hours, in my mind, it was close. But if there's an adverse event, where do I go? If if something's not quite right. And so these are kind of these are the bare bones things that folks are facing in the community, as opposed to, can we explain it to them on a tablet? Can the patient get care if there's an adverse event? We're really back in a different era. And it's just a matter of availability. There are more cows in Vermont than there are people, literally. So what's the option for that group? And how much are you going to pour into that state if there aren't as many people to take advantage of it? So again, there's a lot more issues, and they're certainly not limited to one side of the country or another, or one race or another. So much of it is infrastructure, and so much of it is what people are willing to invest in.
Which is, I mean, I literally didn't even get into any of the topics we thought we might get into, from protocol amendments to investigator meetings. But I'd love to have you back to have that discussion.
Sure.
A couple of quick things. Is there a question you want to ask the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to know what they're seeing on the telemedicine side. If so that, I'd love to hear what's going on that element. If folks are seeing the uptick. Certainly we had the uptick in 2020, but what's the 2021 forecast?
Yeah. Okay. So as you know, we do 2 rapid fire questions. So this is what we have right now. What challenges you?
Oh, time.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm one of those people who likes to read everything, and that takes a minute. That takes a minute. The fine print will get you every time.
There's no fine print if you're going to read all of it, so you're good. Second question. What is the best part of your job?
Oh my gosh. Getting to talk to people who want to help people with cancer.
Oh, that's such a great line. That's awesome.
I mean, just it's not an easy day. For some of these folks, going to funerals is part of their jobs. For some of them, they are watching people in their darkest hours. There was a study commissioned circa 2009 that found that if a woman is diagnosed with breast cancer, only 1 in 4 of them, if they are partnered at the time of diagnosis, will be partnered at the time of the treatment is over. So this is so as the caregiver in the medical landscape, that's a lot. And so people have so many things that they're going through at that time, and it's draining, it's hard, it hits almost every level, and I find that it takes a very special person to do it with grace and the dignity that the patients deserve.
That's wow. Let me do a quick recap of what we spoke about. I mean, that's
sure.
Really heartbreaking. We talked about informed consent today. Talked about but it was important. We talked about informed consent. We talked about your role as a clinical trial manager. We spoke about your experiences being a coordinator, being in having a master's in sports medicine, being a CRA. We didn't even get into the fact that you're an attorney yet. We talked about your experience in medical affairs. We talked about off-label versus salespeople. You talked about clinical trial managers, and their job is to keep the train on time, if you will. We talked about remote audits. We talked about centralized monitoring, risk-based monitoring. I wanted to get into, you talked about the goal of informed consent to keep you truly informed, and that's where I was going to discuss a little bit more around what that even means. We talked about
Sure.
Pennsylvania, and we talked about are Pennsylvania's rules more of a national rule set, and are people doing anything around it? And we talked a little bit about inclusion as opposed to diversity. I guess technically both, but
Sure.
we talked about that as well. Did I miss anything?
No. Just that there's not enough hours in the day.
No, not even a little bit. So nothing in this podcast should be considered to be legal or clinical advice of any kind. It's intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, where can they reach you, Eunice?
I'm on LinkedIn everywhere. And so, I tweet and I'm on LinkedIn. I shouldn't say everywhere. I should say I'm on LinkedIn constantly, and I tweet. And I'm also the chair for the ABA's health law section for the cancer legal advocacy group. So any of those 3 places.
Very, very cool. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment, subscribe. You can find me on Twitter as Darshan Talks, or go to our website at darshantalks.com. Eunice, this was awesome. Thank you so much.
Good to talk to you. Thank you.
Pleasure.